Welcome to the Hazmat Files. I'm your host, Erica Fisher, and today we're diving into one of the most critical and often overlooked hazards facing emergency responders, toxic and poison inhalation hazards, or TIH/PIH. Today, with our incredible group of guests, we're going to explore how these hazards are evolving and what every first responder needs to know. Before our guest introductions, a quick note. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of TransCare or its sponsoring organizations. The content provided is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal or professional advice. Now, let's have each of our guests introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Matt Bond. I'm a logistics manager and transportation hazmat response member within Westlake. Work at a facility where we produce and ship chlorine. Also a member of the Chlorine Institute Emergency Response Issues team.
My name's Matt Paynter. I'm the Emergency Response and Preparedness Manager for Nutrien. At Nutrien, we produce chemicals used for fertilizer and fertilizer products, and I handle our emergency response both internally and externally.
Hello, I'm Ryan Goldsmith. I am the Global Emergency Response Leader for the Chemours company. We ship a large array of chemicals worldwide, and so responsible for anything emergency response related to those.
Thank you so much. So glad to have all of you on today's podcast. Let's start at the foundation. For those who might not work with these materials every day, Matt, let's start with chlorine. Can you highlight its chemical and physical properties from an incident perspective?
Chlorine's good for us as responders as it does have some pretty good properties. We know with chlorine, we understand very distinct odor, similar to bleach, but much more pungent. Absolutely nothing like a bottle of bleach in your laundry room, but very distinct. As a responder, you'll be looking to understand if it's liquid or gas. When we produce it, it comes off as a gas. We force it to be a liquid, but of course it wants to be a gas. As a liquid, it comes off amber in color. We know it's 1.5 times heavier than water. It becomes a gas at minus 29 degrees Fahrenheit. It does have a coefficient expansion, 1 part liquid to 460 parts gas. Also with that, we understand very cold. Chlorine as a gas has a visibility of 25 to 60 parts per million, depending on humidity. Usually when you start to see it, you'll see that faint yellowish cloud as it becomes more pronounced. 1,000 parts per million, for example, it'll start to see more of that green cloud. Chlorine in water will make HCl, so it's important to know that as a responder. Many of the containers in which chlorine's shipped or produced is within carbon steel. So obviously with the HCl that you would produce with introducing water can potentially make it bigger of an issue. As far as with that information, it helps responders on the front end as they start getting descriptions of what they see or what they're hearing. So lots of good warning properties.
And Matt Paynter, how about ammonia?
Ammonia is used for a number of applications. We see it in large industrial refrigerant. Probably most commonly, it's used as a fertilizer. We use ammonia to make several different types of a fertilizer. As far as responding to it, there's a couple of things to point out about anhydrous ammonia. One is its boiling point, or where it turns to gas. So much like chlorine, it loves to be a gas. We chill it to make it a liquid, but its boiling point is negative 27 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 33 Celsius. So as soon as it hits the atmosphere, it's going to want to turn to a gas. So likely as a first responder, when there's a release, you're going to see a white cloud that's formed from ammonia. Now, a couple other things to remember about the properties of ammonia is one is its relative vapor density. So it's lighter than air. It's 0.59. So since it's lighter than air, it's going to want to rise and leave the area, which is good from a responder perspective, except it does find humidity in the air because it has a love of water. It's going to find water, whether it's humidity in the air, and it's going to collect with that water and then come back down to the ground. So if you live in a really humid part of the country, like I do, I live in Georgia, ammonia is going to pretty much stay put. It's going to find plenty of humidity and it's going to sink to the ground. If you're in a drier part of the country, you could expect it to actually rise and move away. which in many cases is the best thing. Also, its expansion ratio is 500 to 1. So as a vapor, it's going to expand really quickly, and often a cloud or a path can be formed or seen. If you see a visible cloud, that's generally an IDLH environment. So if you're seeing a cloud, you need to use caution around it because it's reached those IDLH parts per million.
And Ryan Goldsmith, can you share insights on anhydrous hydrogen chloride, or AHCl?
The properties and the warning properties of anhydrous HCl is much like ammonia and chlorine. We ship it cryogenic, so it's cold. It's a compressed liquefied gas. And as the others spoke about their materials, it wants to go from a liquid to a gas as well. So it wants to expand. In the event there is a release, it will quickly form a gas. The gas has very good warning properties like the others. It will be very white clouds as it's being released because it is very hygroscopic as well. So the moisture of the water and those white clouds is actually goes from anhydrous hydrogen chloride into hydrochloric acid. It's very important to understand that if you're near the cloud or have the potential to be near it, that is hydrochloric acid that you're seeing. While we can use water to help knock the cloud down, just be mindful once it has become a gas, it's going to be hydrochloric acid.
And understanding the chemical and physical properties of TIH, PIH materials gives responders a good foundation. But when it comes to responder safety, it's all about how those hazards actually reach people. Let's talk a bit about exposure. What are the primary exposure pathways responders should be concerned with?
For anhydrous hydrogen chloride, the biggest challenge with it that you need to understand for an exposure pathway is the inhalation hazard. That's our number one priority, to make sure any vapor that you see or you potentially could be in is going to be hazardous. So definitely protection of your airways is a must. And then also with any type of acid, a dermal type contact, so any contact with the skin would be a major issue.
For chlorine, it would be similar. The one thing we know with chlorine, much like the other materials here, is respiratory protection. It is an inhalation hazard. Odor threshold is 0.2 to 0.4 parts per million. Becomes a mucus, mild irritation at 1 to 3 parts per million. Respiratory tract, where it starts to really burn, 5 to 15, and then the persistent coughs and chest pains at 30 parts per million. Respiratory protection is absolutely number one. Then along with that is understanding with chlorine being 2.5 times heavier than air. So it's wanting to rise low as we're understanding what we're working with. Then the second part of that is, I mentioned earlier, with chlorine and water producing the HCl, as Ryan commented on, would be the same thing here, where it becomes acidic to our bodies, eyes, anywhere where you'd have perspiration. And then also we know chlorine can be an oxidizer, can provide heat-related burns. And then also in keeping in mind the colder temperatures of which chlorine's produced and shipped, you start thinking about frostbite potential and thermal burns.
And ammonia is much the same. It's inhalation hazard is your biggest hazard when it comes to ammonia. If a first responder is in an area where there's liquid ammonia, they should avoid it. Ammonia can pool. The parts per million are going to be extremely high, and the responder would be in a level A suit at that point. But if they do encounter pools of liquid ammonia in a fully encapsulated suit, they want to avoid that. The best thing to do would just be cover it with something. We usually recommend covering it with a tarp. For your very first responder, first in engine, 35 parts per million is where we say you need to have on full respiratory protection. Anything below that's going to be an irritant, but at 35 parts per million, you should at least an SCBA. At 300 parts per million is IDLH. So you go from 35 to 300 pretty quickly. And if you don't have the meters, if you don't have a way to detect the parts per million that you're in, you need to have full respiratory protection on. Even trace gas can reach levels higher than 300 parts per million. So it's very important that you wear your SCBA. While ammonia is not flammable, it does have an explosive range. NIOSH is 18 to 25%. So if you're responding to, say, a refrigerant leak inside of a building, that becomes an issue. Those ranges could be met. Open air outside, you're never going to be in that range. However, if you do respond to something that's interior, that should be on your mind as well. I know as a former firefighter, we've been to those calls before, and we just ventilate. We open the doors. We try to make sure that we're not in that explosive or flammability range.
We've explored how these chemicals can enter the body and why even a seemingly minor leak could be a high consequence event. But theory only gets us so far. To truly understand the stakes, we need to look at how these incidents unfold in the real world. Let's turn to some case studies and hear what lessons have emerged from past responses. Matt, Paynter, let's start with you on the ammonia case study.
Yeah, I was going to share a case study. It's an oldie but a goodie because there's lots of good takeaways from this. And this was a derailment that occurred in Minot, North Dakota. This was back in 2002. So it's a little old, but there were some great lessons that came from that. So basically, there were 5 derailed anhydrous ammonia cars, and they had a catastrophic rupture. They estimate about 147,000 gallons of liquid anhydrous ammonia were released. Now, remember, I said the expansion ratio is 500 to 1. So you can imagine how much vapor was formed from that. Now, it was negative 7 degrees, which from an ammonia release perspective, it's still going to turn into gas, but it probably did slow that process down some. This plume, they estimated it moved nearly 5 miles into the town of Minot, where around 12,000 people live. So small town, rural area. It took about 5 days for this whole thing to pan out as far as mitigating and starting the cleanup process. And most of the people in the town were affected by this in one way or another. In fact, there were 11 that sustained serious injuries from it, and about 322 people had minor injuries. So all in all, with the 12,000 citizens in that town, quite a few of them were affected by it. Of the first responders that went to that, there were 122 firefighters total. 7 of them had minor issues, mostly complaining of headache, sore throat, eye irritation. Those were all common with exposure to ammonia. There was 1 fatality that resulted from this. And the reports that came out afterward, it seemed that fatality came when a husband and his wife attempted to leave their house. There was a shelter-in-place order put in, but they attempted to leave, and they were overwhelmed after they got out of their house by a toxic cloud. They ended up getting in their vehicle, trying to drive away, and got involved in an accident. The wife was able to get inside the neighbor's house where the husband wasn't, and that resulted in a fatality. The good lessons that came from that, one was that there was a good fire department response. They knew there was a derailment. They knew there was clouds forming. So they did the very best they can to try to get people to shelter in place, keeping the neighborhood safe, which was the priority at that point. The investigation found the infrastructure and maintenance of the tracks wasn't what it needed to be. And as a result, there's been a lot of changes over the years into how the tracks are inspected. A weld rail system, there was a failure in the track itself that caused the derailment. So there's been stricter standards from that particular incident that have helped make rail transportation even safer. Also, from an emergency response perspective, their warning systems were outdated. So I encourage folks, most towns, their emergency management groups are taking care of those types of warning systems, but that's going to be very important. We're not sure that the husband and wife even heard the warning because there was some failures in the system. And obviously, anytime something like that happens, no matter the size of the town, your 911 system is going to immediately be overwhelmed with calls. So I think that they had a lot of trouble getting the message out. One thing they found, too, is that they were depending on local radio stations, which we've got a lot more technology since 2002. But that was one of their primary ways of getting the message out. And it could be still true today in many of our rural communities. They didn't have the staffing at night to help with those warnings, so they feel like maybe that slowed things down. And of course, the tank car itself, there's been changes to tank car construction over the years. A big change came from this one. It was made with some brittle metals, which the negative 7 degrees affected. And as a result, we had ruptured tanks. Now, it's not known if it was directly the result of the cold weather and the material, but they feel like that was a contributing factor. It's important that your local emergency management or your local 911 centers have a good way to contact people in the neighborhood and people understand how they're going to be contacted. But that's an old case study, Erica, but I thought it was a good one.
Matt, thank you so much for sharing that case study and the lessons learned. It's a critical importance for community members to heed the warning from both shelter-in-place or evacuation notices. Matt Bond, you're going to cover a chlorine case study for us.
Yeah, chlorine ships and cylinders, ton containers, and rail cars. Much of it's in cylinders and ton containers. This was more specific to, I'll say, a small leak at a water treatment facility. One morning, it actually started to leak. The site was getting alarms, and they made some notification to the fire department. The fire department did an evacuation about a mile. Nobody had contacted Chemtrec. They were trying to manage it on themselves. During this time, we didn't get a notification. A guy here at work, he got a notification on his cell phone for a Facebook notification. So that's how we learned of it. So we gave them a call that said, hey, we understand there may be something going on. Is there something we can help with? And we gave them some background on what we do as far as response goes. They asked us just to hang tight for a little bit. We're trying to figure out what we're doing. About an hour later, they called back and said, hey, we think we've got it under control. No assistance needed. We exchanged some information, talked about some training, and we kind of parted our ways. We understood they use chlorine at the facility, but they also use SO2. And we were hearing some rumblings that it might have been an SO2 leak. So we just kind of went on our day, and that was it. Then about 10 days later, the same person that I'd spoke to called and said, hey, we've got something else going on. We've got alarms going off. We need some help. And they knew they had a bank of cylinders in there. They didn't know how much was leaking. They just knew alarms were going off. They said, hey, would you guys be able to help us out? We said, sure. We jumped in the truck. We're about 40 minutes away. The way we're set up into sectors, and we'll talk about that here later, but we went out into a different sector, but it made most sense for our response. When we got there, we met with the fire department. They had an evacuation in place. I think it was like a 1.5 mile evacuation. They pointed to the building and said it's up there. Me and the gentleman that was with me, we went ahead and put an SCBA on and started kind of approaching it with meters. We were getting very small hits. It was not a great leak whatsoever. Once we got into the area where the bottles were, we proceeded to go in. Still no real hits, maybe 1 part per million, 2 parts per million, but that was it. Once we walked in, the first thing that we came across was the fire department had hosed the whole room down with water and chlorine. You get that weak acid, ferric chloride. It starts getting slimy with all that going on. It took us a good while to figure out where the leak was. During this time, monitors were going off on alarms of SO2 showing 6 to 10 parts per million, but we knew it was chlorine with the meters that we had. We did find the cylinder. It was a leak in the base of foot ring where the weld was. You couldn't see it, but that's where we identified it. During that time, we then were able to contain it in a recovery vessel and get back together with the fire department and work with them. The site really had no training with chlorine. They didn't have any knowledge. The fire department, prior to us getting there, had hosed the room down with water. Certainly did not aid in our situation. Again, small leak, but had everybody kind of concerned. Nobody knew to call Chemtrec, and then also we discovered the system, whoever wired that up, when it was chlorine, it was reading SO2, and when it was SO2, it was reading chlorine. So that gave us false reports for the departments. We'd kind of worked with other teams in the area and collaboration between the teams. It was a nice thing to be able to work together, but also with fire departments. That same group, we had invited maybe 10 months prior to that, a training event we did on our site. And they're about 30 minutes away, and they didn't make it. So they didn't understand all this with chlorine. So we actually took the extra hour and just kind of went through chlorine, talked about hazards and response techniques and why water, things like that aren't such a good thing. So it turned out really good. It was a small leak, no injuries, but just a lot of things that we had to shuffle through to work with first responders, and may not have had the background of chlorine as what we did.
Thank you so much, Matt. You definitely highlight some key lessons learned. One of those being making sure that folks do contact Chemtrec in order to activate ChlorEP, which I know you're going to talk a little bit more about ChlorEP here later in the podcast, and also making sure that they're receiving the training that they need, both at the facility as well as the local responders. And I know we're going to touch on training here in just a few minutes. Fortunately, there haven't been any incidents of AHCL while in rail transportation, so we don't have a case study to cover there. When it comes to responding to TIH, PIH incidents, personal protective equipment, particularly respiratory protection, is one of the most important lines of defense. I know each of you already hit on some of the PPE that responders should consider, but are there any other tips or additional information that responders should consider when responding to these types of incidents?
For chlorine, I can't say it enough. Respiratory protection is number one, level B, level A, depending on the scenario. And that can go other ways too, where they may be getting trace amounts of chlorine and they default to a level A. And we often tell people to make sure we have a conversation. I'm not saying level A is, that's absolutely correct, but if you're just looking for 1 part per million and possibly climbing on a rail car, is that where we would want to do? It's just a good discussion to have, especially for unknown leaks, respiratory protection. We hear a lot of people talk about trying to do something less than that, but they walk around the corner and those low thresholds of exposure become a problem very quick. So never underestimate the leak, at least for respiratory protection, 100%.
Much is the same with ammonia. Respiratory protection is going to be the key. I think detection is very important too. Share a short story. One of my coworkers got a phone call from a friend who works in a rural fire department, and there had been a derailment and there were several anhydrous cars on the ground. And he called him and he said, "How do I know it's leaking?" And he said, "Well, how far away are you?" He said, "About 200 feet. And he said, "It's not leaking." That's not the way we want you to do detection. So Hazmat 101, you always stop way back, use your binoculars, try to figure out what the product is. And if it's anhydrous ammonia, then you need to approach very carefully. We recommend that you keep your distance, set up a perimeter, try to evacuate the area downwind, and wait for your hazmat team to get there so that they can be in full level A suits to go in and do a proper investigation.
So anhydrous hydrogen chloride behaves much like chlorine would. Respiratory protection is a must. We definitely have to have respiratory protection, even if we're doing our scene size up. As they've stated before, we want to stay back and have our safe zone set up before we go in. But if we're going to go into the hot zone, respiratory protection is a must. But it has excellent warning properties, as we talked about earlier. So you're going to be able to see the cloud if it is leaking. You're going to know very quickly if it's leaking or not. That, again, is hydrochloric acid. You would definitely need to have some type of dermal protection before you would go anywhere in a hot zone near the cloud whatsoever. Structural firefighting gear is not the most appropriate thing to use with anhydrous hydrogen chloride, but you also have to keep in mind that there could be a frost issue with it since it's loaded so cold. Obviously, we wouldn't recommend any first responders trying to engage any type of a liquid release. As Matt said, the best thing to do is to just get back, get your safe zones established, set up your shelter in places, and then get the appropriate responders coming in to have the appropriate equipment to then mitigate the leak.
And having that right PPE is critical, but as you've mentioned, it's only part of the equation. Responders also have to rely heavily on detection and monitoring tools to understand what they're walking into. That brings us to a key question about readiness on the ground. Are current detection tools in the hands of local fire departments sufficient? Or is there a gap in access or training to detection and air monitoring devices?
Yeah, Erica, I see this quite often, especially in the rural parts of our country. The departments have limited budgets, and they don't always have the budget for meters. Also, they don't have the budget for equipment like PPE in order to even utilize the meters. So in some cases, it might be okay that they don't have the meters because they're not sending anybody down into harm's way because they don't have the proper PPE. I think that's always been a little bit of an issue is funding. And I think it continues to be. Recently, this summer, we did a drill in Iowa, and it was the case there where small rural fire department, mostly volunteer, they have the funds to maintain fire protection. But when it comes to specialized things such as hazmat, their hazmat backup was over an hour away. So they pretty much would just set up their zones, keep people out of the warm and hot zone, and wait until the hazmat team arrives. I think if they had some meters in their hands, they would be able to better assess those zones and maybe even better assess where they need to do evacuation, where they need to do shelter in place. I've told them there's a lot of industry that actually has budgets for some of these meters. So there's a lot of times where we may have a presence in a community and they just need to reach out and say, hey, we feel like this equipment would make us safer. And a lot of companies out there actually have the ability to purchase those for them or to help them purchase them. So that's always a good thing. And of course, there's also grants through TransCare as well that can help with those types of funding. So yeah, still a big need, I feel.
Absolutely. And that's also a great tie back to local fire departments reaching out to the facilities in their community to have those conversations prior to an incident to make sure they have the equipment, the training, and know the point of contact at the facility. And yes, TransCare through our Hazmat Team Response Fund, we offer funding for advanced training or equipment, as well as the Chemtruck Help Award provides funding for departments that help fill some of these gaps in equipment and training and other resources. The best equipment in the world doesn't matter, though, if responders aren't trained. What kinds of hands-on training should every responder have related to TIH, PIH commodities?
For chlorine, we work with an organization, Chlorine Institute. They're a nonprofit trade organization that's focused on safe, secure, sustainable production, distribution of chlorine. There's a strong commitment of that group working with industry. And then back in 1972, they developed a group called CHLOREP. It's their program, Chlorine Emergency Plan. And what that developed was 24/7 emergency response aid network supported by 88 teams from 25 member companies that produce, package, and use chlorine throughout the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Also within that response network is 12 vetted emergency response contractors, and they are also resources of mutual aid for us within chlorine responses. This coverage is mapped out throughout the area, it's divided into sectors, and provides 24/7 availability. Just one call to Chemtruck generates getting you on the phone with somebody of those groups. And that'll allow us to start talking through what the situation is, but also allows us to provide support as a response would be needed. Each of these groups has hazmat response teams. It's a privilege for all of us because it is a great network of people that's supported by the Chlorine Institute. With the CHLOREP group, we do annual training for those members. It's a 40-hour training event in Jackson, Mississippi. We do it at the Mississippi State Fire Academy. Typically, we'll see around 125 students that are pretty much all part of that CHLOREP network. And this training is supported by those CHLOREP teams for instructors. That's the contractors, that's the producers, the packagers, the end users that are there as the instructors. 75% of this, I would say, is all hands-on, developed with the scenarios best for chlorine emergency response training, whether it's a cylinder, ton container, or a rail car. But it also allows all of us to work together, even us as instructors that have been doing it for a number of years. We go there and we continue to learn ourselves. So it's a great opportunity for us to train together yearly.
When it comes to ammonia training, I think probably one of the most underutilized things that we have is TransCare's learning management system. There's a lot of people get on and subscribe to it, but there's so many more that could, and it's free. Anyone can sign on to it. And the courses are fresh and kept up to date. I know recently, I would say, a year or two ago, Erica, we updated the ammonia response portion of that. So the information's kept up to date. So that's a good way to utilize the learning management system. The other thing is there are quite a few events that go on across the country that Transcare supports, the live release drills for ammonia. That's always a big hit. I've been to one of those myself. It's a great hands-on training for first responders on what to do in the event of a release, and they're actually working with live ammonia. If you live in a community that manufactures anhydrous ammonia, whether it's ours or another manufacturer, reach out to them. We love to do events with our communities. We want to be a good neighbor, support our first responders that are in the area. I love the LMS portion of it, and then supplementing that with some hands-on at local sites is very important.
To add to that, they both spoke about Transcare, and Transcare is a excellent opportunity for people to get hands-on experience. As Matt said, you have the chance to work with all the emergency kits that are available to the different containers and cylinders. But not only that, you get to work with the industry experts. You get the opportunity to work with outside emergency response contractors. You get opportunity to work with the railroads. Transcare events is really catch-all that you can get a lot of answers to a lot of questions, a lot of hands-on work, excellent opportunities to do training, to talk with the people that are experts not only in the field, but experts on the equipment, and to really increase your knowledge and skill sets.
You guys have done a wonderful job recapping all of the training and the resources that are out there for first responders. Now, with more chemical shipments, evolving threats, climate changes, the TIH-PIH risks are changing. So what's coming next? How are hurricanes, flooding, heat waves, or other natural disasters impacting TIH-PIH storage and also their transportation risks?
We're seeing that being a bigger issue. We've had some fairly major hurricanes in the last few years that have really gone back to, are we planning properly for these types of things? I think I shared with you, Erica, a bullet tank that was just about underwater. For those that aren't familiar with bullet tanks, they're large tanks that are pressurized. It takes a pressurized tank to fill a rail car or to fill a truck with ammonia. A lot of other products too, but you've probably seen them. Propane's a good example of the large propane tanks. So these bullet tanks, they're usually fixed and mounted, but we had one in particular that we were concerned about because the flooding had come up. We were actually worried it was going to lift the tank off its foundation. So since then, we've really looked at where are these tanks placed. Are they in a flood-prone area? Do we have a way to move water away from them, need be, in the case of a flooding? So I think preparation is a big piece of this. Also, one thing that we've done is each of our sites has to have a response plan for each tank that they have there. So if they have a large low-pressure storage tank, what's your response plan to that if there's a weather issue, if there's some other issue with the tank? They're very safe. They're on a very stringent maintenance program. So I rarely ever worry about the tanks, but with natural disasters being a thing for any part of the country, that's something that you have to look at. So I would encourage first responders, if you have a facility in your area, visit them and say, hey, what do we do about this tank? What steps are being taken to make sure the tank stays safe, whether it's flooding, hurricane impacts, winds, what's in place for that? And be familiar with their plan on how they plan to respond to an issue with it. I think it's very important.
I know within chlorine, we certainly see the impact, and what it was maybe 20 years ago, different today. We see the railroads certainly being more proactive, working, giving us notifications of things that they're seeing in their end. Maybe cars and routing maybe a little bit different. We know we see a lot of facilities a little bit more cautious too, as maybe what we once were. So certainly a lot of thought that's going into it. We also see cylinders, ton containers, those facilities in the industry, they're recognizing that and putting things into address. Remember a few years ago, we got a chlorep call, and it was in a ton container that washed up on shore of a river. It wasn't leaking, everything was intact, but it was odd that there was a chlorine ton container found washed up on a river. Later, we come to learn that a facility had gotten flooded out maybe like 12 years before that, and there was some missing containers, and this is one of them that just surfaced. Forget how far away it was, 60, 70 miles away. Who knows what it had been doing for that period of time, but they're surfacing. And it was interesting when we learned, oh yeah, that was a flood that occurred 15, 20 years ago, whatever that may be, and they're coming back around. So certainly you see the industry, a lot of people that are looking to address that and recognize where they're at and how they're going to protect themselves and the public.
With anhydrous hydrogen chloride, we only ship those on rail cars, so it's highly important, as Matt alluded to, working with the railroads, understanding where the cars are, understanding how we can protect the cars the best way possible. So we work closely with the railroads to know and understand where the cars are, and if we can divert cars out to safer areas or potentially move them back to the facilities to then offload them. We work very closely with them, any type of shipments that we have in hurricanes. But you also got to keep in mind, this day and age, and both the Matts have alluded to this, the all hazard type events. So it's not just hurricanes. We have a lot of tornado activity, it seems like these days, that all can play a role in the shipment and distribution of any of our materials. So having plans in place for not only facilities, but also how you're going to respond and help those first responders out in when you have a rail car or a derailment or a tank truck that's been overturned from a tornado or what have you. Working with contractors to make sure everybody's up to speed on the materials and how to respond is also a very key thing that we have to work with.
This conversation has been packed with insights, and I want to close with a moment of reflection. What is one thing you want first responders to remember when it comes to these TIH/PIH commodities?
The biggest thing I would pass along is just the recognition of what we're getting into when we get into a response, and recognizing what the products are and what the resources are for us as responders. When we think about chlorine, again, I'll touch base on the ChlorUp activation. Once you call Chemtrek and you tell them the location and talk about it being chlorine, that will activate ChlorUp. That'll put you in touch with a person who call you within moments and their background with chlorine. They understand containers and response. So it's a resource that is literally a phone call away that can help us. And then from there, as things start to evolve, the resources that can be dispatched and mobilized to help, whether it's the ChlorUp groups, the producers, the emergency response teams, the contractors, a lot of things can be engaged, but reaching out to Chemtrek and ChlorUp is the first step, but that will certainly help in that response.
I agree with Matt. Reach out. We're just a phone call away. We want to help, whether it's just giving you some technical advice over the phone. The other thing is just take a step back. We just got to slow down when it comes to hazardous materials, especially ones with inhalation risks. Slow down, think about what you're doing, stay at a safe distance, keep others from getting into your zone that could cause harm. Think about evacuating people or sheltering them in place. All that should be going on while you're trying to find the resources you need to help with it. I'll just say we're available. I could tell you the rail companies all have very robust response, and they are there to help. There's lots of resources out. So slow down, take your time, ask for resources.
I agree with all those. And being a first responder for almost 30 years and still working closely with a lot of those organizations, the big thing I want first responders to know and understand is that you're not alone. There's help, there's resources out there. A lot of times the general public think that if there's an emergency or an incident, let's call the fire department because they can handle anything. And obviously, most fire departments aren't trained or equipped to be able to handle every single emergency. So when it comes to hazmat, as Matt said, slow down and make those phone calls. Call Chemtrek, get the shipping contact information, get the people notified. Again, get you technical resources, get you contractors. We have a large array of folks that are willing to help and will come help you by phone or in person. So just don't think that you have to do it all by yourself or that you should do it all by yourself. Take the time, make the calls, and get help coming to you.
Thank you so much. Those are all great points of reflection and key takeaways for the first responder community. To our guests, thank you so much for your time, your experience, and your commitment to safety and training. I know I am truly lucky to have learned firsthand from each of you throughout the last 10 years of my career, and I know the insights that you shared on today's podcast will be beneficial for all responders. While this is the final episode of Season 2 of the Hazmat Files, Transcare is excited for more episodes ahead. So stay tuned for Season 3 to be released next year on all your favorite podcast streaming platforms. In the meantime, stay safe, stay informed, stay trained, and we'll see you next time on the Hazmat Files.